Focus. Ideate. Innovate. Enable.
The Global AI Conclave was an extraordinary journey that left an indelible mark on the landscape of artificial intelligence. The event witnessed a convergence of global and Indian thought leaders, innovators, investors, founders, and disruptors. Together, they engaged in insightful discussions that illuminated the profound impact of AI across industries and societies. Union Minister of State for Electronics and IT, Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, Rajeev Chandrasekhar, spoke with Shireen Bhan as he shed light on India's approach to AI and the government's approach, vision, and expectation from this landscape.
Look, our approach towards AI, I need to first lay out what our government's approach is and what our Prime Minister's vision and expectation of AI is, and then I can tell you some of the other moving parts. We see AI as a very significant bolt-on to this already galloping digital economy. So it is in some ways, we communicate this as a kinetic enabler of our digital economy. So we see a significant amount of growth that we will see come out of AI and the ecosystem that will develop. And while there is a lot of conversation about safety, trust, and the harms of AI, we are very focused on that. For enabling that, we have put together an overall framework that talks about AI compute capacity, the need for the government to deploy resources, financial resources, in creating more foundational models and LLMs and real-life use cases. So there will be, like in the semiconductor model, we will fund startups. We have certainly a very clear focus on building an academic industry startup research ecosystem, which we refer to as the Innovation and Research Center. So we think we will have about 10, 12 of them around the country that will be part funded by the government. And we will have many other adjacent areas, including AI chips, that we are going to have as an intersection between the Semicon program and the India AI mission. So AI compute, clearly, since you asked me that, let me say that we will have two components to it. One is a pure private sector led, very similar to the design in the semiconductor space where we will incentivize that investment. And then we will have a significant indigenously developed public sector capacity of AI compute coming out of CDAC.
Let's talk about one of the challenges that people are putting on the table today, and that is procurement as far as GPUs are concerned. The CEO of NVIDIA in September was talking about supercomputers and how India will be one of the beneficiaries of the faster supercomputer that NVIDIA finally puts out into the market. But at this point in time, OpenAI, for instance, in his words, has about 10,000 GPUs. Given the plans that the Indian government has rolled out as part of OpenAI, etc., do you believe that that's going to be a challenge? You know, we have Chris Miller here who'll talk about the chip wars in a second. Yeah. Just before this, we had a panel talking about the possibility of a glut versus a shortage. Where does the government come in on this, weigh in on this for us?
I will very confidently tell you with more than a little understanding of the situation, that problem of a shortage is the problem that is going to go away the fastest. What we think is the big problem today of AI compute is not really the challenge that we have. I think that is a challenge. There are many other players that are trying to catch up with NVIDIA. Nobody likes $1 trillion market cap and say, I don't have it. So there are the AMDs of the world and there are Intels of the world who are playing catch up. They're 6-8 months behind. So I think if you list out all of the challenges that we have to deal with as government or the ecosystem or startups, that challenge will be the challenge that will vanish the fastest.
So what would you put down as the number one challenge that you're most concerned about?
There are certainly much more fundamental challenges like talent. This is an industry, this is an ecosystem that is going to need really top-notch capability. We need PhDs, we need postdoctoral, we need masters programs in our academic institution to churn out those real cutting-edge talent. This is not coding. This is no longer walk in the park in terms of the abilities that are called to be brought to bear in this area. So talent, I think, is, for me, if something keeps me awake at nights when I talk about semiconductor or AI, it is certainly the challenge of creating a world standard talent. So I think those are the areas that I'm focused on, creating these innovation and research centers that are housed as partnerships between startups and academic institutions. It's not something that we've done very well in. IIT, Dr. Junjunwal is here. That is an exception, a very visible exception to the general rule that academic institutions love pushing out degrees. I was in a program recently with a lot of vice chancellors, and I said, 15 years ago, the way you measured an institution was how many of them went and got hired by Google, or how many students went abroad. I know in my generation, the way you measured an institution as being great is 80% of your batch went abroad. Today, it's a different metric that academic institutions have to pivot to, which is how many of my students are really going out there and building world-class platforms and systems. So all of these are real challenges. The obsession with AI compute, I understand. Part of it is fanned by NVIDIA, I think. They love being in a shortage economy. And so that's fine, that's fair. But I think that will be the easiest problem to solve, and it will be the problem that will vanish the fastest.
I'll end by asking you, do you chat GPT or Bard, or are you using artificial intelligence yourself?
I'm all over the place.
You're all over the place. That's not a very nice thing to say.
No, I'm all over the place, as in I'm on all of them. I'm platform agnostic, as I should be. I'm also on the dark internet, so if you see me in a chat room there and you see somebody who's got a moniker of a minister, that's me, trying to eavesdrop and see what you guys are talking about. So.
I'd now like to invite Mahesh Makhija, Technology Consulting Leader, EY, to join us on stage to present the AIdea of India Generative AI's potential to catalyze change. We have Chris Miller, all the way from the US, the author of Chip War, and he would like to present an autographed copy of his book. I know you've read his book, but this is one for keeps at your office, along with the digital clock.
The Karnataka Minister for Information Technology and Biotechnology, Rural Development and Panchayat Raj, Shri Priyank Kharge, took the stage and was felicitated by CNBC TV18 Santosh Menon.
About our next session, we are calling it How AI Can Turbocharge India, How India in Startup Inc. can leverage generative AI to race ahead in business. And I am so delighted to welcome Shri Priyank Kharge, the Karnataka Minister for Information Technology and Biotechnology, Rural Development and Panchayat Raj. I'd like to invite Santosh Menon from the Network 18 Group to felicitate Minister Kharge.
Moving on, joining from Silicon Valley, Dr. Andrew Ng, the founder and CEO of Landing AI, the co-founder of Google Brain, spoke on how 2023 turned out to be the year of AI.
In fact, we're talking just days after India, with 27 other countries, adopted a Delhi Declaration on Artificial Intelligence. They hope to work together to come up with a governing framework. Do you think that is the best step forward? Can there be consensus at all between different countries?
It would be great to have consensus around different countries. I guess self-driving cars have been going on for a long time. They haven't quite yet worked, but I think if there's a regulatory coherence, it makes it much easier for tech companies, including startup companies, to build and scale and to go global. One of the barriers to startups, going global is if there's a very complex patchwork regulatory framework, which big tech companies can afford to pay for compliance to deal with, but that smaller businesses just don't have the bandwidth to figure out what are all the different laws in all the different jurisdictions and, have lobbyists in all of these different places to deal with it. So I think having some sort of regulatory coherence would be beneficial. The thing that worries me is if we all collectively settle on regulations to stifle innovation and stifle open source, as opposed to regulations to, say, regulate applications based on a properly thought through, tiered approach to risk. I think some things are more risky. Medical devices, hey, that seems risky. Let's regulate that. But this notion that's been floating around that bigger AI models are inherently more risky, that's just a very strange idea that doesn't make sense to me. So I hope we can steer governments away from that.
Another virtual session saw the co-founder and the CEO of Cerebras, Andrew Feldman, speak on the role of graphic processors in AI, challenging the conventional wisdom that machines designed for graphics work excel in AI.
The question here isn't, do we need less compute? Sam is in OpenAI, and I think Mr. Brockman was quoted as saying, he who has the biggest computer will win in AI. The question is what you point this infinite demand of compute. What do you point it at? Do you point it at a collection of smaller models in a mixture of experts? Do you point it at one giant model with 1 trillion or 5 trillion or 50 trillion parameters? Do you work on models that are 100 billion parameters, but use huge amounts of data? So not a trillion tokens, not 5 trillion, but maybe 20 trillion tokens. I think what everybody's clear on is the approximately infinite demand for compute. What's unclear is which flavor of model is going to be used to consume that compute. And there are a lot of really interesting results, right? Recently, Minstrel put out a model that was a mixture of experts. Microsoft has been doing pioneering research in mixture of expert models for a long time. While Sam has said that the models aren't getting bigger, he has the biggest model. And so I think it's very difficult to tell. And there are lots of different ways to skin this cat. And I think we will see together a tremendous collection of different approaches. What will be the same is the underlying need for unbelievable amounts of compute, vast amounts of compute. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity for those who build compute.
Mary Snap, Vice President Strategic AI Initiatives, Microsoft, and Sindhu Gangadharan, MD at SAP Labs India, shared their thoughts on responsible AI, the need for a governing framework, and more.
Having responsible data practices is the foundation when we talk about responsible AI. Right? And the way in which we acquire data, ethical access of data, consent-based access of data, anonymizing the data, making sure that the data is clean and completely void of any kind of bias, making sure that the data is a considerable data set. It's not just about having a small data set, right? Because a small data set will have inherent bias built into that data. So having that right governance in place when you talk about access to data and making sure that the data follows that right kind of regulations becomes very important. Then we heard about having guardrails and regulations in place. Today, it's very important that, yes, we need to make sure that there is right kind of regulations, but it also needs to be done in such a way that we're still able to innovate, right? So the EU Data Act, which you just talked about, has a lot of risk-based analysis on how you would classify AI systems along the various risks. So having a very balanced approach in how we make sure that there's a good way in which you get the data, having the right guardrails in place becomes super important when we talk about responsible usage of AI.
Now, what oversight processes, review boards, or other governance mechanisms do companies need to have in place to align AI systems with the broader interests of humanity?
It's really a great question. I'm glad you asked. I think you first start out with principles, and the principles related to fairness, inclusivity, ensuring that the systems are safe, transparency, accountability. Then you click down a layer below that and think about how then you build these systems. And we have AI champions throughout our engineering team to, in each case, identify the impact of the use of the artificial intelligence in our product, to identify whether the technology is fit for the purpose that we want it to be, to identify risks, to try to mitigate them. In those cases where the use is sensitive, but we actually have been strong proponents for regulation, believing that regulation can spark innovation in certain cases, and that regulation can ensure safety. I got on an airplane, obviously, to come here from Seattle, and the thought of just sort of getting on a plane, closing the door, not getting off for 16 hours, ensuring that the pilot was going to be there, that it was going to be automated, but land, that does not come about without some regulation. That comes about with a lot of standards processes internationally, with government working with the private sector to create that.
Zoho founder and CEO Sridhar Vembu shed light on how India as a nation can win the third wave of digital colonization.
So, one of our challenges as a country is that, we've fended off, you could say, the first wave of digital colonization. We own our own identity. If tomorrow, people's phones are switched off, or the US government instructs Apple and Google to not use authentication, most of the world will shut down. Now we are on the race to about 2 billion people who will have a way to legitimately identify themselves in their own ecosystem. Some of them on Aadhaar, some of them on MOSIP, as you know, 11 countries, 100 million people are already there. And I'm not going to be surprised if we race to about 3 billion in relatively quick time. Payments, we managed to claw back payments, and today I think we'll do 58% of the global digital payments in the world, right? We are already the third largest payment system, racing to become the second. I think we have infrastructure that's been put in place for sharing data, and that's already the biggest. It's bigger than what Europe is using, and I think it'll become significant. But it seems to me that while we managed to do all this, we didn't do a good job with the second phase. All our social media applications, TikTok has been banned for how long? 3.5 years. It hasn't led to a major TikTok replacement. We've had Coup here, competing with Twitter or X hasn't really taken off. So in some sense, we've not done well with this second generation of stuff that is coming. The question is, what will it take to win back this third generation?
So in AI, Dr. Andrew mentioned a few things. One, the smaller models are quite good for specific domains. That we are also seeing. I think everybody is seeing that now with approximately the 7 billion parameter kind of space, you can do a lot. And those models you can run on a laptop. And specific areas, you can make a lot of progress with that. So, in other words, you can do as well in a specific domain with a small model as a big model will do in that domain. Because the big model is a know-it-all. So, with just a small model, you can do specific domains.
Chip Wars author Chris Miller was in a candid conversation with Rohan Murthy, the co-founder and CTO of Soroco, discussed the country's chip ambitions and his thoughts on the strategy employed by India to move up the electronics value chain.
Your book, Chip War, brings this out very beautifully, which is how truly interconnected the supply chain in the chip industry is, right? Which is, you mentioned, for example, ASML in Netherlands, which has 100% market share in producing ultraviolet lithography. Whatever that may mean, it's technology that's necessary in producing chips. And so TSMC has to buy these machines, et cetera, and so on. So it seems like a really coordinated global effort to really produce chips.
That's right. It is coordinated. It's simultaneously coordinated and concentrated. And it has to be concentrated because the economies of scale are so large that you need just one, or in some cases, 2 or 3 firms in each segment of the supply chain. And that's true for the manufacturing process, where TSMC is. It's true for the machinery, where ASML, as you mentioned, is. It's true for the materials. A lot of the chemicals and gases used in chip manufacturing have to be purified to the 99.99999% level, because if you misplace a single atom, you can at times cause defects in the operation of the chips. But recently, with the acceleration of tension between China and Taiwan and the competition between China and the United States, the geopolitical, the competitive aspects have come much more to the fore. And they're changing the ways how basically every chip company thinks about the industry.
Right. And so has there ever been, in your estimation, an industry like this, which truly requires, where no one, sounds like it at least, no one country can emerge as the winner who can make everything from start to finish to produce a chip? And so you necessarily need global cooperation. Has there ever been in history such an industry before?
You know, I think it really is somewhat unique. If you think about most of the other goods we manufacture, like cars, there are multiple countries that have a self-sufficient car industry. If you think about most types of manufactured goods, that's basically true. And the reason is because there's nothing that's so hard to manufacture as semiconductors. Cars are easy in comparison to making billions of virus-sized particles with basically perfect accuracy. And so that's why you basically have to rely on this international supply chain. And so right now we're actually running a test in real time, which is that China is trying to build its own supply chain, to not rely on Taiwan, not rely on the US, not rely on Japan. And we're going to see how feasible it actually is to undertake. It'll certainly be expensive. It'll take a while. And whether it's feasible at all, I think, remains an open question.
So in such a world, Chris, what role do you think can India play? Now, in the sense that, okay, so India can't say we'll go at it alone, because that's not possible. Okay, then at best, find friends or neighbors or people whom you get along with and create some sort of a supply chain. So what is the right strategy for a country that is likely to be amongst the top 3 or 2 global economies in the next few decades?
Well, I think before we ask what role can India play, the first question to ask is what role is India playing? And I think here in Bangalore you can find tens of thousands of people who already work in the chip industry. And that's actually a very strong base to build from. Most countries don't have that. And I think that's a real key asset that India has that the rest of the world actually looks on somewhat enviously. I've been told, although there's not great data, but I've been told by people who have tried to count it that there are more people in the chip design industry in India than anywhere else in the world. Which I think is true. And so that is an extraordinary base of human capital from which to build. But when you look at what the Indian government and Indian businesses are focused on, they're focused on chip design, justifiably so, but also on the manufacturing and assembly process. A pretty broad stretch of the supply chain. And I think that's a reasonable approach. Certainly when it comes to chip design, there's a lot more focus right now in design across the world, because as Moore's law gets harder to sustain, as it gets harder and harder to manufacture smaller and smaller transistors, you've got to rely more on design to provide your performance improvements. And if you look at what differentiates NVIDIA from AMD, it's not the transistors. TSMC does both those companies manufacturing. The difference is the design and then the software that's built on top of them. So design makes a lot of sense, I think, to focus on. And then on the packaging and assembly side as well, I'm struck by all of the investment that's going into device assembly in India across the country. And so it makes a lot of sense to me as well to think about packaging and assembly being part of that. And in the past, packaging was low value add. It was labor intensive, not an exciting part of the value chain. But today there's a lot more energy, a lot more R&D going into the packaging space as packaging becomes a driver of advances in semiconductors. And so I think that's also a sphere where it makes a lot of sense for India to focus on.
enabled.